let's just say somehow an indicator came loose or a piece of tape. The gasket can potentially remain intact, but now we got something between the door and the actual gasket itself, like a piece of tape, like a label from a tracking system, right? So we want to do that visual inspection, and typically the manufacturers will tell us to use a critical water and do a wipe down. But again, you got to be careful because the machine is very hot.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Hey there, Sterile Processing Universe. Hank Balch in studio with the one, the only
R.A. Parker. I'm just kidding. I always told myself, Hank, if I was an author, I was going to go by R.A. Parker instead of Bobby Parker. So just trying it out for a day.
Rah, 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 huh?
That's right. Can't go by Robert Parker. He's one of the greatest English American authors, and I can't write like Robert Parker does. So I got to go R.A. Parker.
Yeah, Parker's one of those common last names. It's like Smith out there. And so if you get a common first name like John or Robert, you're just doomed to always have to say, not that Robert Parker, the other Robert Parker or Bobby Parker. So, c'est la vie. We can't all be named Hank Balch, right? Okay, back to the topic at hand. This is actually not an episode about how we name our children or how we rename ourselves, because Hank is not even the name that my poor dear mother gave me. And she reminds me about it every time I see her at Mother's Day and other times throughout the year. Anyways, no, we're talking today about sterilizer gaskets, the most random thing unconnected to names there can possibly be. But speaking of names, we got a big name coming in studio with us today. Big Dave Jagrosse. He has been out there for decades in the space, not only on the clinical side in the hospital, but also consulting around the country and around the globe. You've probably even seen him in your hospital or at the various conferences and trade shows out there in the space. We're going to have Dave in today to talk to us about sterilization, gaskets, and all things related to the safety, the maintenance, the design, and purpose. So hang with us here. We'll be right back in just a moment to start this conversation with Dave Jagrosse.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, Clean Freaks, we are in the studio now with Dave Jagrosse, the president of David Jagrosse Consulting. He's also the supreme commander of the northern basements, or maybe the whole entire East Coast basements out there in sterile processing land. Dave, welcome to the podcast today.
Hey, thank you for the intro. It's great to be here. It's always exciting to meet up with you and the Clean Freaks out there.
Thank you. So I know a lot of folks are going to know your name and your voice even, but we've got a lot of new folks tuning into the show these days. Been around almost for 7 years now with the podcast, but there's a lot of folks who have begun sterile processing in just the last couple of months, couple of weeks, maybe stumbling across this show. So if they don't know Dave Jagrosse, how do you describe yourself?
Sure. And that's great. I hope there's all newbies listening to this, including my own son, who's in the business now about 7 months. But
he's new.
I've been in the business 35 years, and I started like you newbies out there, on the job training, off the street, learned everything I could, technician, supervisor, manager, got involved with my chapter, got involved with the standards organizations, got involved with HSPA, built up my consulting business to the point where 5 years ago, I have the pleasure of coming out and tuning up SPDs and working with medical vendors now full time.
Yeah. And if you're connected with Dave on LinkedIn, or if you see him on Facebook, he's constantly posting his flight paths from point A to point B. So it's like you're bouncing around 24/7, man.
This could be you, newbies.
That's right. All right. Well, so we're going to jump into the topic at hand today, Dave. And, you know, this was one of what has turned out to be a season full of kind of random topics, but real life topics. Like we encounter this every single day in our workflow, but something tells me that anyone tuning in, this could be the first time if they've ever sat down and really thought about this topic for 20, 25 minutes. And it's the topic of sterilizer door gaskets. So we're going to spend the next few minutes with you diving into what that is and why it matters. But let's just start with what it is first. How would you describe this thing?
You got it. And what a great topic. Like you said, we deal with it almost every single day and it's right in front of us. Well, if you're running an autoclave, you're going to have a door gasket. You know, if you look at your autoclave, you always think of them as almost a box inside of a box. And in between those two, the next time you're in front of the autoclave, open the door up and you'll see that gasket running around the entire edge of the front of the chamber. And it's typically made out of silicone and something that can tolerate the high heat. And it's what's going to create the seal in between the door that you're opening and then closing and the inside of that chamber.
That's perfect, Dave. And since we're talking about newbies, and we probably all have seen a sterilizer, but what exactly does a gasket look like? Are they, all flat and black like a head gasket in a motor? Or are they big, fat, round, squishy things? Like what is it that we're looking for?
Yeah, and that is a great point, because even us more seasoned people, it's inside the autoclave. If you see them outside of the autoclave, depending on how large your vessel is or the chamber of the autoclave, it's literally a one-piece round silicone gasket that will fit inside of the groove in the autoclave in between those two chamber spaces that I talked about.
Sure. So gaskets typically are trying to prevent leaks. I don't know what it is this season, but we keep going back to cars. Gaskets are what keep your oil from dripping onto the driveway and things like that. What's that gasket doing in the steam autoclave, and what would maybe be the ramifications if you didn't have one?
Sure. I mean, it's a twofold purpose. Most of us are running, now get ready, newbies, dynamic air removal cycles. Include pre-vac and SFPP, which is steam flush pressure pulse. Most of us are running pre-vac cycles. When we run those pre-vac cycles, we are pulling very deep vacuums, and then we're putting the steam in the chamber under a tremendous amount of pressure. So the primary purpose of that gasket is to not allow that steam to come shooting out of that chamber. But also, and this is a piece that a lot of us have to think about, is it also prevents, when we're pulling those deep vacuums, it's preventing air from coming in through the door. And that is one of the primary reasons we run, according to the IFU of the vessel or the autoclave, we're going to run a leak test. And then we're also running our Bowie-Dick test, or DART test, as other companies might call it.
So on that leak test, I'm glad you brought that up. We were going to get to that if you didn't bring it up either. So this is a good time to dive into that. I know I worked in facilities before that had never even heard of a leak test before. It's one of those things that it can easily get missed if it's not in your department culture or training or in services around the specific autoclaves that you're using. So can you just kind of speak a little bit more to what that leak test is testing? I guess it's kind of in the name. You're testing for leaks, but is it leaks that's just implicated in this gasket conversation that we're talking about, or can the autoclave chamber leak other places?
That's great,
like
Hank. Yes, I know where you're getting at because I highly suspect you know that answer and you're drawing it out of me. But
I don't know, but we'll see depending on what you say if I know it or not.
You're pulling the answer out like the autoclave is pulling air out of the chamber. Yeah. So think about this. Think of that vessel and putting it under a negative atmosphere. And these are the things that you see when you look at the gauges on the autoclave, the physical gauges, if they're there, you'll see it pulling that vacuum. And when we pull that vacuum, we want to make sure, of course, the door is the largest surface area where air can come in. So, we talked about a continuous round silicone gasket. It could have a pinhole in it. It could have it doesn't have to be a catastrophic failure, but it could have a hole in it. It could be letting a little bit of air in. But then beyond that, we have to be concerned about the drain of the autoclave because there's a steam trap down there. And hopefully when we're pulling vacuums, we want to make sure that we're not pulling air in either from the drains area, or we also, in our business, there's a big science behind our steam quality. We want to make sure there isn't air in our steam, but there's a whole other podcast probably we can do on that. But we're running that leak test. It is pre-programmed by the manufacturer. They determine how often you run it. You should make sure that you're doing that. And it's really challenging that in a mechanical fashion. It's looking at the gauge and making sure when it's holding that negative air in the chamber, when it's holding a negative state, that no air is coming in. Otherwise, we'd see the gauge fluctuate. And earlier, I mentioned the Bowie Dick and the DART. The DART test stands for Dynamic Air Removal Test. Those are separate tests. A leak test is run typically by itself with no test devices or anything in the chamber.
So because we're on this topic and because you're out there consulting in the field every day, I know you've gotten this question about the leak test. If our leak test doesn't quite pass, does that mean that we can't use the autoclave? So what do you say to that question?
Yeah, I would always refer everyone to the manufacturer's IFU because that's going to be your guidepost. And then what is your policy and procedure? Even before that, Hank, I go in and I see a lot of people just not running the leak test. That's probably the bigger one. And then I think what I typically see out there is if they do fail, they'll rerun. And if it fails again, they contact service. Some facilities I see it fails and they immediately will call service.
Well, and I think there's some facilities out there that don't do a leak test because they know if they did it would fail. Yeah. And so it's like, I'm not going to take the test and then I'm going to have a plausible deniability.
Correct.
And just keep using this thing because everything else is passing. So let me just ask one more question here on this because it is all connected since we're talking about the gasket. But how can or why does, or, maybe even you can answer a different question. If there are leaks in our chamber, these other tests can pass that you described. Like, the BI can still be killed, for instance. And so
maybe a chemical indicator, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So it creates these dynamics that, we hate in sterile processing where we get tests that are telling us competing things, like one test pass, one test fails. How can that happen in this dynamic if that vacuum that you're describing is such a key component to effective sterilization?
Yeah, we want to make sure air is our enemy in this instance in the chamber because we kill by having direct steam contact with the surface, correct? So we don't want any air, whether it's through steam quality or whether through it's a leak in the gasket, air may be coming up through that drain that we mentioned, or any other port, if you will, that goes into that vessel. So, we are checking that really twofold. we're looking at any potential leaks from the outside coming in, performing that leak test. And then directly after that, if we're counting that, if the machine is counting that as cycle 1, then cycle 2 is that we're doing our Bowie Dick or that Dart, depending on the brand. That's also looking at air, but it's also a better measurement of steam quality if there's air there, because any air that's in that chamber is going to want to dwell. It's going to flow, if you will, down to where the lowest part of the chamber is, where that drain is, because everything's trying to go out of that drain. And that's why we always know, and if you're new, that we place that test over the most challenging part of the chamber, and that's over the drain.
Sure. And that air can act kind of as a blanket to keep the steam from getting to your instruments, or in this case, the test, right? So
absolutely.
We want to keep
well over it. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned the mechanical tools we have to try to evaluate the seal of the chamber, both through the gasket and the seam trap. But what about just visual inspection? What kind of visual inspection would you recommend somebody go through to make sure that the gasket's in good condition, beyond just doing their weekly leak test and trusting the result and moving on?
Sure. And, we'll always preface ourselves with saying to anyone, old or new in the profession, that's seniority wise, is to check the IFUs. Okay. These vessels are very hot. So you want to open the door. You're going to typically have an inspection, and we are using steam from the plant, from the boiler room. And there is an entire document, AMI ST 108, which was formerly the TIR 34 on water quality. And whenever we talk about water quality, we're talking about steam quality, because water makes steam. But we want to make sure that we have good steam quality, because you look inside that vessel and you look at the door when you open it, all of that buildup can build up on the gasket. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because let's just say somehow an indicator came loose or a piece of tape. The gasket can potentially remain intact, but now we got something between the door and the actual gasket itself, like a piece of tape, like a label from a tracking system, right? So we want to do that visual inspection, and typically the manufacturers will tell us to use a critical water and do a wipe down. But again, you got to be careful, because the machine is very hot.
That's a great point, and particularly for the manufacturers that have some kind of extended cleaning instructions for those users to do that involve getting some chemicals in there, it becomes particularly important not to apply those hot, because then you're immediately evaporating it and getting chalky residue all over the place.
Correct.
I'm not saying this from experience, of
I was going
course.
to say, it sounds like you lived that a little bit. Wow.
Yes.
That's right. So really important. So yeah, you got to dig into that IFU, look at those PM requirements, and make sure that those are kept up with. Dave, in your experience, I know you've seen a lot of different facilities and ways of doing things. Those PM requirements, or I guess, daily maintenance requirements, like looking at gaskets and doing that wipe down, who do you typically see being the primary, party responsible for doing those? Is that sterile processing, or are there other folks coming into the department doing those daily checks?
I would say a majority is sterile processing. I don't really see biomed or those types of departments coming in. And the service rep is really there for preventative maintenance. He's not going to be there daily. We need to own that really as part of SPD. We're doing all the daily testing. It's a great time to do that. I'm a big fan of quality systems in these departments. And with quality systems, our checklist. And this should be on your checklist. Another little thing I like to typically do, at least I did when I was a manager, is have my techs go back there. Go back behind the sterilizer and take a peek, because, outside of the gasket conversation, there might be a leak occurring that you don't see. And you don't want to see that leak until it starts coming out to the clean side. So include that on your checklist to just give a visual check behind those sterilizers, make sure everything's functioning, there isn't steam blowing off somewhere or water pouring on the floor, and address this door gasket because it's that critical.
That's a great call out to any engineers or architects that may be tuning in. We do need to be able to physically get back there to see what's going on.
Hank. They're locked. Yeah.
Well, they lock them and then they build them where there's not even, like, you can't even get to where you need to do repairs or actually see them. And that's more common in the older facilities, I know, but still it's an important call out for anyone listening there. I know you mentioned the checklist. We love kind of getting these practical takeaways for leaders, especially that are saying, oh, that's right, I haven't been doing that check, potentially. And so now they've got this idea around the checklist. What have you seen be most helpful and less intrusive on, getting the checklist done? But then, like, are you seeing most people do like a paper checklist? Is it built into their tracking system? Are you seeing some kind of combination of both? Where do they store this? Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't all know because some of us are new, but anytime we create a paper log, and say we're going to do something, we better do it, because accreditation bodies and departments of public health and potentially legal ramifications, people can come in and do discovery. You want to make sure you're doing what you say you're doing. But it is, Hank, it's a combination of both. I've seen the best is because it's more practical to take a physical paper around with you. And then I see people scan that into the tracking system so that's the record. It's a better archive for the record.
So, Bob and I were in a department and, we've been talking about how things should work. But at one point we worked in a department that had an autoclave that occasionally, if it just didn't feel right that day, or maybe you didn't get quite the tweak and turn on the wheel of the door, at a certain point in the sterilization cycle, it's just like a locomotive. Steam just went out. And I mean, this thing's blowing steam out. And you got noise, and then you got, the visible steam and everything else. How common is that occurrence? Obviously, like, we're not in every department at all times, and there's all kinds of different equipment. But is that the kind of thing? Clearly, that would signal a problem. Is that common out there? And if so, or if not, what other common related issues have you seen around this kind of vacuum seal conversation that we've been talking about today?
No, this is good. And we could actually tie it back to the question I think Bobby mentioned earlier, is just who does it. I mentioned SPD, yes, with the checklist, but you must have a robust preventative maintenance program, because I've seen, all of us have seen hospitals that, we'll go back to the car analogy. I'm not changing my oil every 3,000 miles. Well, you better change this door gasket because there could be some really big, potentially harmful things that could happen if these gaskets go. And I'll talk about that in a second, but you also want to make sure as part of your preventative maintenance that you have proper door alignment, because as you mentioned, Hank, there's different mechanisms. There's wheels, and then there's other ones where you just press a button. But I remember back in my career managing the department that we've had to have the door alignment addressed a few times also.
That's professional door alignment, right? That's not just like, yes, hey, let's find the biggest, strongest tech over here to kind of etch this thing in.
Get the ortho mallet.
All right. So, we have dug into one of these little things, but obviously I don't even have to say it. Big deal. These sterilization gaskets are tremendously important to the mission for effective steam sterilization. We don't just want it to go through the cycle. We want it to do what it was designed to do, which is to kill all these bugs and make these instruments safe for patients. But clearly, this is not the only little thing in the department that could make a big impact. So before we kind of let you go here, Dave, I'm curious, what other little thing would you want to put on this list to call people's attention to a little bit more?
Sure. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to give people an idea that in my career, I mentioned 35 years, I've seen door gaskets fail, and I like to tell people this. If you have no business around an autoclave while it's operating, then don't hang around near an autoclave, especially in front of that door. Because if you do the mathematics of an autoclave at, we'll go on the high end of 32, 30 PSI. If it's a 6-foot chamber, you're looking at 14,500 pounds of pressure behind that door. So we know they look like bank vaults. We're hoping and pretty confident the door isn't going to blow off, but all that pressure will come through that door gasket. I've seen ceiling tiles come shooting down it. It's pretty frightening, even if you're across the other side of the room. So really important to do this. And I wanted to make sure that we included that statement.
Now that you have me scared to walk in front of an autoclave next time I'm in a department, what's the other little thing that you want to bring up today before we wrap here?
It's probably not a little thing. It's a little thing that can become a big thing. And I think that's really the pass-through window. Hand-washed items. On a majority of my audits, everyone has very robust testing, sonics, testing the sink temperatures, testing the washers, and then they're hand cleaning all these items and just putting them on the window and passing them through. We have tools for this space. We have ATP swabs. We have protein swabs. So that really is a big one that you need to look at.
And yeah, for those who can't see Bobby and I because we're doing this audio, we're sitting here shaking our heads like, hey, man,
got our next podcast.
Say it louder. Yeah. That's right. All right, Dave, well, really appreciate your time and your insight. Obviously, you have seen this up close and personal, throughout the years, and you've been able to learn from all the other customers too, that you've helped kind of navigate these steam sterilization issues. So thank you for dropping this tremendous knowledge with us today.
Yeah. Hank, as you know, we're all in this together. And if it is a war, our enemy is infection. So that's why we all do what we do.
And that was Dave Jagrosse, president of Dave Jagrosse Consulting. Bobby, wow, we covered a lot of ground. It made me think about that episode that we did a couple of seasons ago, talking about the buoy dick test, and we kind of dove into all the nuances around that. But this is a great kind of part 2 to that, because now we talk about the mechanical side of it, and again, particularly these gaskets and what can go wrong, what you need to look for. I thought it was just a terrific insight all the way around. Yeah, for sure. And Dave does a great job of breaking it down to its principal parts and walking through slowly. It's like he does this for a living, Hank.
Yeah.
Just felt like a fireside chat with Uncle Dave, had us understanding gaskets in no time there. But yeah, really important topic. I was excited to see this one on the deck of episodes for this season, and kind of the memories that you mentioned of the of the autoclave leaking steam out of the screaming autoclave, the train whistle in the department, and how to avoid that. So yeah, I appreciate Dave. Yeah, the IFU conversation obviously came up a couple times in this interview, and it's easy when we say IFUs to immediately go first to the surgical instrument IFUs. I think that's probably the most classic ones, because they're piped in through these different programs you can subscribe to, and they're on our count sheets now and kind of linked into them. But then we look kind of around behind us, and then we see these equipment here, and they also have IFUs, and they also have requirements around PMs and cleanings and whatnot. And I think there's more awareness of that, today than maybe there was 5 years ago, but there's still a lot of gaps. I know we kind of alluded to the leak testing, and is everyone doing it? If you're not doing it, why are you not doing that? Is that compliant with the IFUs? So I hope this is a challenge, to everyone out there who maybe hasn't looked at your steam autoclave IFUs closely, not just how to hit the buttons and run the cycles, but everything else that's involved in that mechanical aspect of the machine. Hopefully this prompts some deeper thought. So as we wrap here, we're not done with season 25 of The Little Things That Make a Big Difference in Sterile Processing. Hang with us. We've got a lot of great guests coming and great topics to finish off this season. But until we talk to you again next week, We want to remind you, like we do each and every week here at Beyond Clean, to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.